And now it's time for our Thursday's Meet at Korea. And joining us in the studio for all that and more is Professor John DeMoya from Seoul National University. Professor DeMoya, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
As always, thank you for having me.
So today we're going to be talking about the Potsdam Conference back in 1945. I mean, it is a very significant event, especially for Koreans, because it basically was the decision to divide the peninsula, right? Leading up to the eventual Korean War 5 years later on, and obviously held the implications for the future. What kind of discussions took place at Potsdam, and what effect upon the Korean Peninsula? We'll talk about this, but first and foremost, so let's get some background on this. What and when was the Potsdam Conference?
Sure. Potsdam is in the summer of 1945, roughly late July into early August. So for reference points, we're talking about prior to the dropping of the bomb, prior to the surrender of the Japanese. And it is got to get this in my own head, the UK, the US, and the Soviets sitting down and essentially imagining the existing, they're going to have to divide Germany, and thinking about the scenario to come, which we know now would be the surrender of Japan. But at that point, they don't know this, so they're thinking about what do we do with Japan to get them to the table. And so division of Germany and how do we deal with Asia, imagining post-war scenarios. And this is where, of course, it's very important for Korea.
So what were the meetings prior to Potsdam that can provide maybe a background to this particular meeting that we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, sure. The ones that usually come up for Korea, I don't have exact dates, but I can give you a rough ballpark. Cairo is somewhere in late 42 or 43. That's the one famous.
We talked about this before, right?
But it's worth mentioning exactly.
Yeah.
Famously, it comes up that Korea will be dealt with, quote unquote, in due course. We'll talk about Korea later. Yeah. And Koreans love to cite this because they're essentially dismissed. I don't, again, have exact dates, but Yalta is earlier in 45, and that's when Roosevelt is very ill. So that Potsdam usually comes up as the new President Truman is there, but it's often talked about almost exclusively in terms of how could Stalin potentially manipulate this guy who's just coming to the table, just kind of getting his footing under him, so that it's usually the senior Stalin, the senior Churchill, and the very junior Truman trying to figure out what's going on.
Right, exactly. And this is, we're talking about the President Roosevelt, who had basically, was it in his fourth term?
1932 to 1945, correct. He was there for a really long time. Because,
he really was.
And obviously the laws now no longer allow more than 2 terms.
Right, exactly. And so that's when the Harry Truman comes in.
Yes.
And that kind of course, Harry Truman also the president when the Korean War was happening as well. Let's talk about the actors that were present at the Potsdam Conference in 1945.
Okay, so we have a very senior Joseph Stalin who is clearly interested in primarily probably dealing with never having to deal with the German problem again, and seeking presumably the most advantageous sort of buffer situation possible. Churchill, I'm not quite sure what his agenda would be, but he's certainly looking at a post-war scenario which would presumably preserve a certain amount of UK role in whatever now we would call, the free world scenario will be. And Truman definitely, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is definitely imagining a post-war world in which America is going to be dominant. And most importantly, and this is where the fun between Truman and Stalin comes up, this is the famous meeting at which he mentions to Stalin that the Americans have a new device. And Joseph Stalin just kind of hints and says, I know. And Truman is signaling, of course, referring to the atomic weaponry. And Stalin, as we now know, is probably referring to the fact that, by the way, we have spies and we kind of know about this.
Oh, snap.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they didn't know at the time, but we now know this. And this came up a lot in the Oppenheimer movie that was out last year.
I didn't get a chance to watch that movie, by the way.
If you ever get to see it in the movie, Klaus Fuchs is the guy who's the German Nazi physicist who comes over and helps them. We now believe pretty strongly that Fuchs is the conveyance from Los Alamos to the Russians.
And so the Soviets actually knew that there was nuclear weapons because of
I don't know if Truman got the reference, but apparently in the records of the meeting, Stalin basically says like great, and like he doesn't say like I know, ha ha ha, but he says like kind of like yeah I know. And I don't think the Americans, but again, now reconstructing, we now pretty much are sure that they had some idea of what it was. And as you know, the blueprint for the Russian 49 bomb is pretty close to what,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so there's that, I mean, now Russia has the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons right now. And so, I mean, it really changed.
They basically had the information. They had the blueprint. They did not have yet the technology, and that took them a couple of years.
Right.
Yeah.
What was the official agenda of the conference,
Yeah,
though?
as far as I can say officially, I don't think, again, because they did not know that the surrender would be that quickly, that we can say that it was exactly post-war division of Japan. But clearly dealing with what happened in Europe in May and then doing the division, and then imagining ways of bringing the Japanese to a faster resolution, which, as it turns out, was actually fairly quick. This is where it gets interesting, and I know you'll ask me more, but Korea, of course, I think comes up in the context of as a Japanese colonial possession. That is to say, in the context of the larger Japanese empire, I don't think it's the way Koreans think it is. Like Korea was not central to this discussion.
Right.
It's more like what will we do with the Japanese empire?
So at the time, then, it wasn't even like now that Korea is going to be independent, free, but it's more like it's the state of Japan that there were.
Well, again, I
place?
think they're trying to, and I can get to, and obviously this comes up a little bit more later in 45. I think they're thinking of more post-war Japan imperial resolution and how do we deal with the larger possessions, in this case referring to Taiwan and Korea. And also, just if I can stick this in here too, if you know this, the actual reason the Kuomintang gets to Taiwan is not 49 in the Chinese Civil War. They're there in 45, just like Migunjuk is in the U.S., to actually occupy as the nationalist China representing. They're actually taking over from the Japanese Empire. Yeah. So I know that this stuff comes up. What happens in August of 45 has implications for the next 70 years.
No, it really does.
Yeah, exactly.
Because when we talk, also Potsdam Conference is actually not covered too much when we talk about world history.
Because it's right before the end of the war, and everyone cares about August 15th.
Yeah, exactly. That's what everyone talks about, right?
Yeah.
So, in the script here, when you talk about the weapon being famously mentioned indirectly, you're talking about the nuclear weapon and what Stalin said.
Truman doesn't say this, but Truman that's what he's clearly talking about, because they have just done the tests. This is July of 45.
Is that not a problem for the United States?
Meaning that they're giving the information to the Soviets? Or
the Soviet basically indirectly saying, Stalin going, you guys have...
But again, I don't think the United States quite got that until later when they do the unpacking.
Are they slow? I mean...
But let me go the other way. This is famously controversial, and this comes up in the movie Oppenheimer, because the Americans are telling the Soviets this late without mentioning it to the bomb that, by the way, we've been preparing this the last several years and we're telling you now.
Right.
Which, to be honest, also is the Americans signaling to the Soviets that in a post-1945 world, you better not have any more ambitions.
You know what's
In other
crazy?
words, it's not directed at you yet, but it could be.
I don't know too much about the Manhattan Project.
Sure.
But I mean, it must have been very, very, very secretive.
Oh, yeah,
right?
It was, exactly.
And for the Soviets to be still able to infiltrate that.
Oh, yes, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Right? And still get that. I mean,
this is the whole movie is General Groves was obsessed with security. Oppenheimer was more obsessed with knowledge. And in the process of bringing over the scientists like Fuchs, who came over from the Nazis, depending on who you believe, some who were taken for their knowledge were not vetted as carefully as they should have been. People moved around. Right. Groves was always telling Oppenheimer, stop talking to your former left friends in Berkeley. I don't think it was that, but Fuchs definitely has. Fuchs ends up getting arrested later and doing time for this.
Yeah. Oh, obviously.
And then other people get roped in too. That's more of a question, but he's the main one.
So let's talk about Korea, right? How was Korea involved in the meeting, and what was specifically discussed in regards to the Korean Peninsula?
Sure. This is where it gets interesting. Well, first of all, there are no Korean representatives directly. It's basically the three major allies. But Korea comes up in the context of what if we get Japan to surrender or get them to come to a resolution will be done. And I think it's more in terms of very loose, Korea and Taiwan, again, 43 in due course. I don't know the exact language, but something along the line of we will have to deal with these possessions. Yes, they might be independent, but as we now know, in practical form, it will become the Kuomintang occupying Taiwan, Migunjuk occupying Korea. So where this comes up, and again, we can say more about this, is we'll get to it in a little bit. The official story is that the official division is rapid August 45, just before the surrender. This version is some Korean scholars, in going through the documents, have speculated there must have been more. They must have already planned this. And there are references to Japan and Korea. There's no smoking gun. But again, some scholars have wanted to find they must have had more thorough plans. It couldn't have just happened spontaneously in August 45. So it depends on how much pre-planning do you think the U.S. did for the division. They said the two major narratives, which I can get, is the August right before the division narrative, or people who speculate that there had to be more done here.
What baffles me is that there was no representative from Korea.
But think about it. Korea, from the American perspective, again, I'm not defending it, is a colonial possession of an imperial power.
Well,
I know what you're saying.
Right,
I know what you're saying. They know Isingman. They know...
Right, because if there was going to be some sort of plan, right? I mean, because it seems like the Americans are basically going, look, we're going to enter Korea.
But my other guess is, too, if you think about it, probably they talked to the Kuomintang because that's nationalist China and they're taken seriously. I don't think they ever talked to any... for lack of a better vocabulary, indigenous Taiwanese, Hakka leaders, people who are on the ground, in the same way that they probably don't talk to any Koreans on the ground.
That is...
Yeah, and
wow.
wait, if you anticipate, this is why Mi Gun-jung was such a disaster.
Well, it didn't turn out too well, right? Let's talk about how the division of Korea was defined at this time, okay, and how long it was, I guess, was it to plan?
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I hint ahead to the official, account, and then we can...
Sure.
So the American story that is still dominant, and Bruce Cummings tells us and a few others, is just before the surrender, when they know they're going to have to occupy Korea, so let's say some date in the early teens of August 45, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, who are two American officers who have no training. This, by the way, is the same Dean Rusk who later will be really important in the Johnson administration. They are told, by the way, guys, you got to find a dividing line. They go to a series of maps. This is like August, 10th, because it's after the 9th or 11th. And they take the 38th parallel, which has never previously been an international dividing line, although sometimes it had been speculated. And the reason they choose it is because it gives, in theory, the American Seoul a roughly half of a division. And to remind you of this is critical. The Russians have already invaded Manchuria and are already going down the peninsula, so they could theoretically, because the Americans don't arrive until like 3 weeks later.
Right.
So it's basically like, could you guys stop there and we'll meet you there? And the proposal is that that's where they will meet, is the 38th parallel.
Oh, really?
Now, the reason, again, why that's August 45. The reason scholars have pushed back to Potsdam and said they must have discussed is they can't believe that it was this spontaneous and this unplanned and this arbitrary. The question is whether you believe that the Americans had that little forethought. But that story I just gave you for August 45 is still pretty much the standard, supported by historians. There is a documentary record for that. The people who want to push to Potsdam want to look further and say there must have been like off the books talks or a little bit more discussion. They can't possibly have been that silly.
And that's the other side, right?
Yes, exactly. And then obviously in between positions. But yeah, those are the two extremes.
Scholars aren't talking about this, but that's probably what happened.
Very possibly, yes. And if you're an extreme conspiracy, which I don't want to go to, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you're like, they did that, but they put this story on the books because they didn't want to admit that they did that.
Wow.
But also, to be clear, too, the more moderate position, they clearly did not have exact timeline. And as you know, later with Mi Gun-jung, when they talked trusteeship, they went from, we're going to be here for a couple months to, we agree with the Soviets that we'll be here for 5 years.
Yeah.
Trustee. And this is when the riots and demonstrations and things break out.
When you look at the way that the peninsula is divided, right?
Yes.
And how close Seoul is
Supposedly, they just looked at a map.
That's all they did.
Yeah.
Because Seoul is so close to the border, right? Whereas Pyongyang goes a bit
but that's also
it.
why they chose it, that they liked the idea that it would be in the American zone.
They like that? The fact that it was close to the border?
No, but they wanted Seoul. That's why they chose the 38.
Right.
Yeah, they could have gone further. I see what you're saying. They could have gone further north, but they wanted a line above Seoul.
Wow. Okay. I mean, these are stuff. There are certain things that I'm learning for the very first time here. But let's talk about, or I should say, how should Koreans think about Potsdam in terms of its impact? Then
I'd be clear. Yeah, I would not. I personally, although people are more than welcome to, I would not indulge on the conspiracy theory side of things. But certainly, I would say Koreans do need to recognize and rightly complain that they need to recognize that their role in this was not, they were not brought to the table, they were not involved in this, and there is some justifiable questioning of this earlier, like why were we not brought in on this? And arguably, Taiwan.
No, that's exactly what I said. Why weren't they brought in on this, right?
Yeah. I think it was the American perspective of we're dealing with the Japanese Empire. Korea is not a major concern.
Really?
You got to understand, Korea... Okay, this is me. Korea becomes a major concern in June of 50.
June of... Well, I mean, the war happened, right?
It is a concern, but remember that in August 40, late 48, 49, the Americans dropped the troops down to several hundred. That's the one time they never leave, but the troops are... Because the ROKA is supposed to... This is also why the Americans weren't ready for the Korean War. They didn't think it would happen.
So... If all the things that were being mentioned at the
Yeah.
Potsdam Conference, right? Obviously, with the war going
Yeah, it's
on,
mostly Germany and Japan.
and so Korea was not really at the top of their agenda. I mean, and rightfully so, right? Rightfully so.
I have not looked at it definitively, but I can tell you what I have looked at, which
Yeah.
is the American plans for like the School for Military Government, which was post-war planning. It's all Japan and Germany. They were not looking at any of the other tiny, possessions of Germany, possessions of Japan. They're looking at Berlin and Tokyo. What do we do with that?
Really?
But this is 42 and 43.
And so whatever happened on the Korean Peninsula and all the things that happened later on, I mean, it almost kind of like they just did it ad hoc.
We've got time. Let's put one more thing in mind.
Sure.
Remember when they tell the Soviets to invade Manchuria because that's bringing up the two fronts and that brings Japan to the table? I don't think they thought, because that's exactly how the Soviets then continue into the northern part of Korea. And I don't think the Americans were like, they're only like stop when they realize, wait a minute, it might be the whole peninsula. Oh, well, let's meet at the 38th.
What was there a clear? Okay,
Yeah.
that's another thing
Exactly.
I'm very curious about.
Did they have a clear stopping point to the Soviets?
Yeah.
No, as far as I know, no. That's the point. The 38th is more, please stop and we'll meet there.
So the U.S. started seeing, okay, they're moving a little bit too further south right
They've
now.
done well. Now they're doing too well.
Right, and so now we have to start stopping them. We got to meet at the 38th
And
parallel.
August
is what
15th is
happens.
going to be the surrender. We're now talking in a room in D.C. on August 10th or 11th. Wow, let's draw a line. And they were surprised that the Soviets accepted it when they could have easily continued all the way.
That is
Again, this is the official story.
mind-boggling.
Now you get why some scholars don't buy it.
No, that's so mind-boggling. How things could have changed, right?
Oh,
If-
yeah. No question about it.
I mean,
Or they could have easily, when they said invade Manchuria, say, but by the way, don't go into Korea.
so when you say that Soviets were pushing down, we're
Yeah.
not talking about like troops going in there and just kind of ransacking everything.
No, what they were doing, of course, was taking arms from the Japanese and accepting the surrender and slowly finishing off the last remnants of the Japanese Empire on the peninsula. It was more intense pushback in Manchuria. Probably in here, the Japanese were like, here, take my gun.
So because something that we haven't talked
Yeah,
about
sure.
here is because there might be some misunderstanding
please.
that there was basically the Japanese military weren't able to fight off the Russians that were pushing down.
I see what you're saying. And yes. And also, let's face it, at this point in the peninsula, with the Japanese Empire being spread out all over the place, there probably was no longer a heavy armed presence.
No.
Precisely. It was more about industry.
Yeah, and so I think
probably the few people here were like, yeah, you want my gun? Sure.
a lot of the focus was on the bigger war, right? I mean, the Korean
Precisely.
Peninsula was basically, okay.
But Manchuria was pretty intense. I mean, the few days between August 6th or 7th or whenever the Soviets invade and the end of the war, that's when they capture hundreds of thousands of Japanese, some of whom, by the way, just to throw in another interesting footnote, end up as guests of the Soviet Union until the 1950s.
When the Soviet is pushing downwards, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And how much of this information is going to Kim Il-sung now before it?
Oh, wow. I see what you're saying. It's a good question.
Right, because now you start thinking now when at what point does Kim Il-sung go, okay, we have some Soviet influence, maybe I could get something out of this?
Yeah, you'd have to talk to someone who's an expert in North Korea to get the point. You can tell I'm back. I'll say this. He shows up, obviously, in Pyongyang, in the fall of 45?
Yeah.
But are we coordinating this that early? I don't want to go there. But I get the logic, yeah.
No, because I start thinking all the possibility, all the things that could happen, because the interesting thing about today's segment is that we talk about what's known and what's being taught by the scholar. However, there are
it's
other...
still very much in dispute.
Exactly.
And one other thing to throw out here, too. This time, and also a little bit later in 46 and 47, the other big thing, because the Soviets have suffered during the war, they are allegedly taking factories, equipment. So there's a big question about how much seizure of what would later become North Korean industry, but was then Japanese industry. In other words, did the Soviets take any of the industry for the spoils of war and basically take
give
it
it to the North,
and or take some of it for themselves?
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Both.
I know we used the word conspiracy theory, but this is probably the first time where, because
I get it.
Like it almost seems like it could happen.
It's fun stuff, yeah.
Right. Like conspiracy theory is a little bit too hard word.
45 through 50 is still very much very contested territory in lots of ways.
Let's. We talked about the division of line, right, and how this was basically chosen. I mean, August 1945.
Yeah, somewhere between the 9th and the 15th.
Yeah, and then it's between 9th and the 15th.
Well, because the dropping of the second bomb and the Japanese haven't surrendered yet, but you know it's coming, so you're deciding.
That's the other thing, though. You know it's coming because once it dropped, and then
you know that they're arguing in Tokyo. Some have said we're already at surrender. Others, and you know that they're hopefully going to resolve it between the emperor and the people who don't want to surrender.
And all this time that's happening, how is the Soviets still moving down?
I don't know when they stop, but they definitely, obviously, at some point, at least stop at the 30th. The other thing that's really interesting, and I'll ask you because have you ever seen pictures of the Soviets and the Americans meeting at the 38th?
Yeah.
but they're not that common. Everyone thinks about the Korean. They actually meet at the 38th in September 45 when the Americans arrive. For whatever reason, because maybe Cold War, those pictures do not become common kind of images. Everyone thinks 50, not, yeah.
We probably got with this segment. I think this might be very new to a lot of our overseas listeners because
the world could have been a very different place.
Oh no, because all we talk about is 38th parallel. That's how they decide they're going to divide this, and we don't.
No, if you're interested, it's the Ruskin Bone Steel story. You can find various versions of it, but the Bruce Cummings version is the dominant version if you accept the current historiography.
And it's amazing that the land that the Soviets were able to take throughout this time is eventually what North Korea is all about.
And this is if you believe the version of the Soviets being heavily involved, at least in the early North Korean state, which many people do.
And the Soviets could have easily said, whatever we just took right now, this could be like part of our country. However, they decided that this was going to be North Korea.
Exactly, a buffer satellite state, as opposed to Soviet territory.
And why was that? Why was that a better decision?
It's a good question. I don't know.
Right, because
I'll say this too. If you know the formation of the early North Korean state, they use a lot of the Koryo-saram that were taken in the 30s and 40s and placed them prominently in positions in the early North Korean state. That's why Kim Il-sung later purges those guys. That's when they de-Stalin. But that's not until the later 50s.
Because I keep thinking in the perspective of the Soviets, right, and how different the history could have been if they decide not to stop. The fact that they actually handed this over to the North Koreans and say, hey, listen, Kim Il-sung, I like the fact that you like our ideology, communism and stuff like that, Stalinism, and we're just going to give you this place.
But I mean, if you think about it, the situation with the Soviets and North Koreans isn't that different from the situation with the Soviets in Eastern Europe in that they are nominally independent, even though we know they were heavily Soviet,
And which is why you probably now see why then the U.S. were so heavily involved with the Korean War, because it was literally...
They saw this as the Soviets extending their reach.
We often talk about how it was North Korea versus South Korea, and this is the Korean War, but it was literally what the Soviets versus the U.S. and obviously the UN command.
And then China when they get involved.
Right. China gets involved with this.
Some call it the proxy for the Third World War. Let's practice and see what's like. If we can push each other, let's not.
Can you imagine what would have happened? I mean, we just had the Second World War end not too long ago.
This is why everyone was like, let's get this finished, but at the same time, we're looking ahead to a post-war scenario in which we might butt heads again.
And we were talking about how one of the more controversial decisions, Koreans do not like the fact that Truman did not give the green light on the atomic bomb.
You mean a couple years later? Spring of 51. I'm sorry.
Because they were saying, well, China doesn't have atomic bombs at the time.
Yeah,
Soviets don't have it.
Well, no, they do have it in 51, but probably in far fewer. They get it in 49.
They get it in 49. So if Truman were to okay it,
in theory, I'm not going to go there.
And then you would have thought the Soviets would have definitely responded.
No, but I would say you get the basic understanding. Truman did not want World War III on his hands.
Exactly, and that's what I'm trying to get into is that the fact that because we only talk about why Truman did not decide to use it.
Truman
but
was
the whole
a very careful, judicious guy. He doesn't get enough credit for actually not sending us into the next Stone Age. And also MacArthur wanted to attack Manchuria, and
he definitely wanted to.
And Truman wanted nothing of that.
I don't think that would have been a very good decision.
No, Ridgway was the guy who was like, we're not doing that.
Because we often credit MacArthur for the Incheon landing. I mean, great stuff, right? Great stuff.
But when he ignored those messages coming from guys crossing the border saying there are hundreds of thousands of troops in those mountains, and he said, no, it's a few Chinese, he was way wrong.
Oh, yeah. And that's the other thing that doesn't get talked too much. And it's just incredible how
there were guys defecting, and Truman thought. MacArthur thought they were rare. He thought it was propaganda. Wow. He didn't think the Chinese were really up in the mountains, and they were.
No, they were. Oh yeah. I mean, it did not do. They did not do well. Let's just as they got closer.
That's when they all come out in October, November 50, and then everything. We know the Korean War is more complicated.
And then go back to the 38 parallel where everything started.
And that's where we are
today. It's just. We always talk about just what's known, but the what ifs are the things that we don't talk about.
No, in a nice way, you're right. Potsdam is one of the few times just before August 15th where they had time to sit in a room and vision ahead, and they got some things dead right, and they had other things where they probably could have done but you can't predict the future. We have the benefit of hindsight.
Well, I mean, because not enough discussion on the Korean Peninsula was going on at
Precisely.
Potsdam.
and also, arguably, to be honest, looking back, I mean, you just bring it to today's conversation, maybe they should have talked about Taiwan a little bit.
Yeah, okay. That, again, has the longer term,
because that's another, we're still with it, exactly.
Professor Demoya, fascinating stuff that we discussed today. And again, even for myself, learning something new on a weekly basis. Thank you as always. Have a safe rest of the week, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks very much.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang Radio application or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.